When Japan looked across the Pacific in the late 1930s, it saw a sleeping giant, large, wealthy, but slow to anger. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, America was a nation of comfort and commerce, not discipline and conquest. They believed the Americans had no will to fight. Japan's admirals thought that if they struck hard enough, fast enough, and decisively enough, they could crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet before the Americans even knew what hit them. Their intelligence reports claimed America's Navy had about 296,000 sailors, a massive force on paper, but one scattered across 2 oceans and a dozen distant bases. Japan believed that number would never grow quickly enough to matter. In Tokyo, the war planners studied charts, maps, and reports from spies and diplomats. They calculated that America could take at least 5 years to rebuild a destroyed fleet. If Japan could dominate the Pacific during that window, if it could seize the Philippines, Guam, and the Dutch East Indies, it could force Washington to negotiate. In their minds, the war would be short, brutal, and victorious. At that time, Japan's Navy was among the most powerful in the world. Its pilots were among the best trained. Its battleships like the Nagato and Yamato were engineering marvels. The Japanese saw themselves as the samurai of the sea, disciplined and fearless. They compared the Americans to soft merchants, men who might own large ships but lacked the spirit to fight in them. The Japanese Naval General Staff, drunk with pride and victories in China, believed destiny itself was on their side. Then came December 7th, 1941. At dawn, Japanese carrier planes screamed down upon Pearl Harbor, raining destruction upon the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In a matter of hours, battleships burned, airfields were destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans were dead. To Japan, it was a triumph beyond imagination. Tokyo radio called it the greatest naval victory in history. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, watched the reports come in with grim satisfaction. But deep down, even he understood what others did not, that Japan had only awakened a monster. That morning, while Japan celebrated, Yamamoto is said to have murmured words that became legendary. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He knew what Japan's leaders refused to believe, that America's true strength was not in its current fleet, but in its potential to create more. In Tokyo, military officials dismissed that fear. They calculated that America's industry, while vast, was slow. They believed it would take years to replace the ships lost at Pearl Harbor. Japan planned to use that time to secure a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Once they fortified it, they thought the U.S. would never dare to cross the Pacific. And in those first months of the war, Japan seemed unstoppable. Their navy swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Hong Kong fell, then the Philippines, then the Dutch East Indies. British warships were sunk in the South China Sea. The rising sun flag flew over vast stretches of ocean. Japan's sailors, trained to perfection, moved with precision and pride. They were confident they had proven their superiority. Inside Japan, propaganda painted America as weak and decadent. Posters mocked the lazy Yankees and boasted that Japan's discipline and spirit could overcome any industrial difference. In their eyes, machinery alone didn't win wars. Courage did. The Japanese Navy believed that a smaller but superior force could always defeat a larger one if its pilots and sailors had the will to die for the emperor. The early months of 1942 seemed to confirm that belief. At the Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese cruisers and destroyers annihilated Allied forces. In the skies, Zero fighters dominated, outmaneuvering American planes with ease. Every victory fed the illusion that Japan had found the secret to defeating a giant. Hit fast, hit hard, and never give it time to recover. But behind closed doors, a few Japanese strategists began to worry. They studied reports of new American shipyards opening on the West Coast. They noticed strange new ship designs, escort carriers, and Liberty ships being produced in incredible numbers. They saw photos of American women working in factories and pilots training by the thousands. To the more cautious minds in Tokyo, these were warning signs. America wasn't breaking, it was building. Still, the Japanese war machine pressed on, confident that its tactical brilliance would always win the day. After all, they had sunk battleships and carriers with precision airstrikes. They had stormed island after island. Their submarines roamed freely. And yet something strange was beginning to happen. The enemy was not shrinking. By mid-1942, reports began to filter in that the U.S. Navy had already replaced many of the ships lost at Pearl Harbor. New carriers were appearing in the Pacific. American destroyers, faster and more advanced, were being spotted in growing numbers. At first, Japanese officers thought the reports were exaggerated. How could the Americans build ships that fast? It didn't make sense. At the same time, Japanese sailors began noticing something unsettling. The enemy they had mocked was adapting. American pilots who once fled from Zeros were now fighting back with ferocity. New planes, the F-6F Hellcat and the Corsair, began appearing in the skies. The Americans were learning, improving, and coming back stronger after every battle. At headquarters, Japanese intelligence still estimated that the U.S. Navy had only a few 100,000 sailors. They didn't realize that back home, the United States was undergoing a transformation unlike anything in human history. America had switched from peacetime to wartime production with breathtaking speed. Factories that once built cars now built tanks. Shipyards that once made fishing boats now launched destroyers. Every day, steel, oil, and manpower poured into the war effort. But to Japan, that reality was invisible. Thousands of miles away, across an ocean they believed they controlled. From their perspective, they were still the masters of the Pacific. They had carriers, cruisers, and submarines spread across an empire that stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea. To most Japanese commanders, it looked as if their gamble had worked. They couldn't see the truth forming beyond the horizon, that the United States was no longer the same nation they had attacked at Pearl Harbor. It was now an industrial juggernaut in motion. Hundreds of thousands of new sailors were being trained. Massive shipyards along the West Coast operated around the clock. Every week, new vessels slid down the ramps into the sea. And when those ships began to sail west, Japan would face a reality it had never imagined, that its proud navy, built over decades of sacrifice and discipline, was about to be dwarfed by sheer numbers and unstoppable production. For now, though, in the early glow of victory, Japan still believed it could win. They still thought their 296,000 sailors were facing an America only slightly larger, slower, and less willing to bleed. They had no idea that soon they wouldn't be counting hundreds of thousands of Americans. They'd be counting over 2 million, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. In the months after Pearl Harbor, America changed in a way no nation ever had before. Overnight, a country built on peace, business, and leisure transformed into a roaring engine of war. The shock of the attack had burned away all hesitation. The United States, once divided by isolationism, now stood united by rage, resolve, and purpose. Every man, woman, and child became a part of the war effort, and that effort would soon create a storm unlike anything Japan had ever imagined. Factories that had once built cars for Sunday drives now produced tanks, planes, and artillery. The same assembly lines that once rolled out Ford automobiles began building B-24 bombers at astonishing speed. In Detroit, the auto industry became the arsenal of democracy. Every major American company joined the war. General Motors built aircraft engines. Chrysler made tanks. Even refrigerator and typewriter companies switched to making rifles and ammunition. But nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the shipyards. The U.S. Navy needed ships. Fast, thousands of them. Congress had approved one of the largest naval construction programs in history. The goal was simple: flood the Pacific with so many ships that the Japanese would drown in steel and gunfire. All along America's coasts, from San Francisco to Norfolk, from Puget Sound to New Orleans, shipyards blazed with light day and night. Welding torches flashed like lightning as tens of thousands of workers built destroyers, carriers, submarines, and transports. And for the first time in history, many of these workers were women. They came in overalls and scarves, answering the call their brothers and husbands had left behind. They were nicknamed Rosie the Riveters, and they became symbols of America's unstoppable spirit. At first, the scale of production seemed impossible. Building a Liberty ship, a cargo vessel essential to carry supplies, used to take months. But American engineers changed everything. They redesigned ship components to fit like puzzle pieces and introduced assembly line construction to shipbuilding. Soon, new ships were being launched every few days. In one record-breaking case, A Liberty ship was assembled in just 4.5 days. News of these achievements spread across the Pacific. Japanese intelligence officers couldn't believe it. Their own shipyards were skilled but limited. Japan lacked oil, steel, and manpower. Its workers were already stretched thin, and its resources came from conquered lands that were now under constant attack by American submarines. Meanwhile, America had access to everything: endless steel from its mines, oil from Texas and California, and manpower from a population more than double Japan's. By the end of 1942, the numbers told a terrifying story. In less than a year, America had added more than 600,000 new sailors to the fleet. New destroyers, carriers, and submarines poured out of shipyards. Entire naval bases were being built on islands that had barely been mapped before. And with each new ship came hundreds of young sailors, trained and ready to serve. Back in Tokyo, Japanese planners watched the reports come in with growing disbelief. Their original estimate, that the U.S. Navy had around 296,000 sailors, was now hopelessly outdated. By mid-1943, that number had already doubled. American carriers were appearing faster than Japan could sink them. The Japanese Navy, which had started the war with confidence, now found itself constantly on the defensive. Still, Japan refused to admit the scale of what was happening. They convinced themselves that quality could still defeat quantity. They believed that their superior training and the courage of their pilots could balance out America's numbers. But reality was closing in. In 1943, the United States launched a new wave of naval power, the Essex-class aircraft carriers. These massive ships became the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. Each one could carry nearly 100 aircraft, and they were arriving one after another. American shipyards built 24 of them before the war ended, a number that stunned Japan's high command. The Japanese couldn't comprehend how such a feat was possible. To them, shipbuilding was an art form, slow, careful, deliberate. To Americans, it became a science, fast, efficient, industrialized. Japan's greatest ship, the super battleship Yamato, took over 5 years to complete. In that same time, America could build hundreds of warships. And it wasn't just the ships. The Americans were producing everything at a scale no one had ever seen: torpedoes, aircraft, radar systems, and ammunition. By 1944, American factories were producing one plane every 5 minutes, and the Navy was commissioning a new ship every single day. From the air, Japanese reconnaissance pilots began to see evidence of the growing fleet. Where there had once been scattered convoys, now there were vast armadas stretching to the horizon. Task forces with dozens of carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moved through the Pacific like floating cities. When the U.S. Navy struck back at battles like Coral Sea and Midway, Japan got its first real glimpse of the machine it had awakened. At Midway, Japan lost 4 of its frontline carriers, a blow it could never fully recover from. But for the United States, the losses were painful but temporary. Within months, new ships replaced the old. New squadrons replaced the fallen. America had turned war into an equation, one that Japan could never balance. The Japanese admirals began receiving reports that made their stomachs tighten. They had started the war believing America could only field a few hundred ships. By 1943, that number had exploded into thousands. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had more sailors than Japan had soldiers in its entire army. The numbers were staggering. Ship by ship, plane by plane, America's war machine swallowed the Pacific. Every destroyed vessel was immediately replaced, often with something larger, faster, and deadlier. To the Japanese, it felt like fighting a ghost. No matter how many ships they sank, more kept coming. One Japanese officer later wrote, "We could sink 10 ships in one battle, and by the next month, they would have built 20 more. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket." As 1943 turned to 1944, the difference between the two nations became undeniable. Japan's shipyards were slowing down. Its fuel reserves were shrinking. Its pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. But America's war machine was only accelerating. Even the Japanese sailors could feel it. When they spotted new American fleets, they were shocked to see unfamiliar designs and unending lines of ships. "How many do they have?" they whispered to each other. The answer: more than they could count. In Washington, U.S. Navy officials released new enlistment numbers. By the middle of 1944, over 1.6 million sailors were serving in the U.S. Navy. The figure stunned even the Americans themselves. And they weren't done yet. Training centers kept expanding, academies worked around the clock, and new recruits poured in every week. From the smallest Liberty ship to the mightiest aircraft carrier, America's sea power now seemed limitless. Japan had once looked across the Pacific and seen a sleeping giant. Now that giant was fully awake, standing tall, and armed with the greatest fleet in human history. For Japan, the realization came slowly and painfully. The war it had planned to end in months was turning into a nightmare. Its navy, once the pride of the empire, was being hunted, surrounded, and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By late 1944, American naval strength had passed all imagination. Over 2 million sailors were now serving under the Stars and Stripes, and more were joining every day. The Japanese, who had once estimated they would face 296,000, now looked at the reality. 2,034,343 men, hundreds of thousands of ships, and an industrial empire that stretched across an entire continent. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan had fought with courage and skill, but courage couldn't outbuild factories. And while the rising sun still flew over scattered islands, the tide of steel and manpower was rising higher with each passing day. They had awakened the giant, and now they were watching it march across the ocean toward them. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. Where once the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed with confidence, now it moved with fear and caution. The tide that Japan had unleashed 3 years earlier had turned, and it was now roaring back with unstoppable force. For Japanese sailors, the change was not gradual. It was sudden and brutal. The once proud fleet that had dominated the seas after Pearl Harbor now found itself outnumbered, outgunned, and outproduced at every turn. The Americans, who had once been the enemy they mocked, now seemed endless. An industrial storm spreading across the ocean. Everywhere Japan turned, the Stars and Stripes were there. Massive carrier task forces, each one larger than anything Japan could now field, filled the horizon. American submarines prowled the waters, sinking tankers and transport ships that Japan desperately needed to feed its war machine. Even the skies above the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. Waves of American bombers flew over its islands daily, guided by radar, communications, and an endless supply of fuel and ammunition. By mid-1944, the Japanese Naval Command began to grasp the magnitude of their mistake. Their intelligence report, which had once confidently listed America's naval manpower at around 300,000 sailors, now spoke in numbers that seemed impossible. 2 million American sailors? Over 1,000 major warships? It couldn't be real. But every new battle confirmed that it was. The clearest proof came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japan's carrier fleet, once the period of the empire, sailed out to stop the American invasion of Saipan. It was meant to be a decisive counterattack, one last chance to turn the tide. But when Japanese pilots reached the American fleet, they were met not by a few carriers, but by an entire wall of steel and aircraft. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 stretched as far as the eye could see. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 28 cruisers, and nearly 400 planes in the air at once. The battle turned into what American pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day, while the U.S. lost fewer than 30. The Japanese Navy had trained its aviators for years, believing their skill could offset any numbers disadvantage. But now they faced an enemy with more planes, more pilots, more fuel, and radar-guided defenses that shredded incoming attacks before they even reached their targets. As the battered remnants of Japan's air fleet limped home, one thing became painfully clear. Their carrier power was finished. Without trained pilots and without replacements, the mighty Imperial Navy was now a shadow of what it had been. Meanwhile, the Americans were just getting started. When Admiral Toyoda, Japan's combined fleet commander, received reports of the disaster, he was silent for a long moment. Then he reportedly said, "We have lost the war." It wasn't just a loss of ships or aircraft. It was the realization that Japan could no longer keep up. But even that grim realization was only the beginning. 4 months later came the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. The Americans had come to retake the Philippines, and the Japanese saw it as their last chance to destroy the U.S. fleet. They gathered every ship they had left, battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, nearly 70 in all. To Japan, it was a desperate gamble, a final throw of the dice. But when they faced the U.S. Navy, the scale of America's power left them speechless. The Americans deployed over 300 ships, including 34 aircraft carriers and 1,500 aircraft. Entire task forces moved like clockwork, coordinated by radio and radar, resupplied by fleets of tankers and repair ships. It wasn't just a navy, it was an entire industrial civilization floating on the sea. Japanese sailors who survived the battle would later say it was like watching an ocean made of steel. Wherever they looked, there were American ships, destroyers darting between the waves, cruisers firing broadside after broadside, and carriers launching endless waves of aircraft. The fighting raged for days across 1,000 miles of ocean. Japan threw everything it had into the battle, including the giant battleship Yamato, the largest ever built. Its 18-inch guns could hurl shells the size of small cars, but even that power couldn't change the outcome. American planes swarmed over it, striking again and again until the skies turned black with smoke. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 10,000 sailors went down with their ships. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was now broken beyond repair. The Americans, though bloodied, barely slowed down. Their shipyards replaced losses faster than Japan could even count them. When word of the defeat reached Tokyo, despair spread through the ranks. Even the most loyal officers could no longer deny reality. Japan had been fighting against a force of nature, a nation whose industry could build faster than Japan could destroy. In the following months, the scale of America's domination became almost surreal. The U.S. Navy now controlled every major sea lane. Massive fleets moved from island to island, each invasion larger than the last. At Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond, Japanese soldiers saw something they had never imagined possible. Wave after wave of American ships unloading men, tanks, planes, and supplies without end. For every Japanese destroyer that still sailed, the U.S. Navy had 10. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 50. Even as Japan's fuel reserves ran dry, the Americans were building more refineries and tankers. The once great Imperial Navy, which had once ruled with fear and precision, now existed only as a shadow, scattered, starving, and hunted. To the Japanese sailors who still fought, it was heartbreaking. They had grown up believing in the divine power of the empire and the courage of its navy. Now they faced an enemy that seemed infinite. Some captains, refusing to surrender, ordered their ships to go down fighting. Others turned to desperate suicide tactics. The kamikaze, pilots who sacrificed themselves in flaming dives against American ships. But even those terrible acts could not turn the tide. America's Navy absorbed the blows and kept moving forward. For every ship damaged, 10 more stood ready to fight. Japan's desperate bravery was no match for an opponent that could rebuild faster than it could destroy. One Japanese officer later confessed, "When we saw the full might of the American fleet at Leyte, we knew it was over. We had thought they had hundreds of ships. We saw thousands. We had thought they had a few 100,000 sailors. They had millions. At that moment we understood. The war was already lost." That realization spread like a quiet sickness through Japan's surviving naval officers. It was the death of pride, the end of illusion. The empire that had believed it could defeat the world's largest industrial power with courage and discipline now faced the truth. Machines, manpower, and organization had won the war. As 1945 approached, Japan's ports stood empty. The seas around its islands belonged entirely to the United States. American submarines had strangled Japan's supply lines. Fuel was gone, ships rusted in harbors, and factories sat silent. The once mighty Imperial Navy could no longer even leave its own shores. And far across the ocean, in the shipyards of California, Oregon, and Virginia, new American ships were still being launched every day. Destroyers, carriers, and submarines rolled down the slipways like clockwork. The number of U.S. sailors, now more than 2,034,000, kept rising. It was more than Japan's Army, Air Force, and Navy combined. For Japan, the war had begun with confidence and calculation. 296,000 American sailors, they had said, easily outnumbered and outmatched. But now they stared at the numbers that told the story of their defeat. 2 million sailors, thousands of ships, and an industrial empire that spanned a continent. They had misjudged America, not just its power, but its will. And in that misjudgment, they had doomed themselves. By early 1945, Japan's empire was dying. The proud naval officers who once toasted victories in the Pacific now stood on empty decks, staring across harbors filled with wrecks and rusting ships. The sound of engines and shipyard hammers, once the heartbeat of Japan's power, had fallen silent. What was left of the Imperial Navy hid in shallow waters or under camouflage nets, hoping to survive another day. Every Japanese admiral knew the truth, even if no one dared say it aloud. The war was lost long before the Americans reached the Japanese mainland. The empire had gambled everything on the idea that the United States, soft, divided, and materialistic, would tire of war quickly. But instead, Japan had awakened something it never expected, a united nation fueled by limitless industrial power. In the final months of the war, Japan's remaining ships were ghosts. The once mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, now sat in port, short on fuel and ammunition. When orders finally came in April 1945 for Operation Tengo, a suicide mission to attack the American invasion fleet off Okinawa, even her crew knew it was hopeless. The ship had only enough fuel for a one-way trip, but they went anyway. When Yamato left port, Japanese civilians gathered on the shore, waving flags and shouting "Banzai" as she sailed toward her death. For a moment, it was as if the old pride of the empire had returned. But over the horizon waited the reality of modern war. Hundreds of American aircraft spotted her from the sky, and within hours, the world's largest battleship was under a storm of bombs and torpedoes. The air turned to fire. The sea boiled around her hull as American planes struck again and again. No Japanese gun could reach them all. After 2 hours of bombardment, a final explosion tore Yamato apart, sending over 3,000 men to the bottom of the sea. Only a few hundred survived. For the sailors who watched from other ships or from the coast, it was more than just the death of a vessel. It was the end of Japan's naval dream. The ship that had symbolized imperial might was gone, sunk not by another battleship, but by a swarm of mass-produced American planes. That was the truth of the war. Courage could not defeat production. Back in Tokyo, leaders still clung to illusions. Military propaganda spoke of decisive battles to come, of kamikaze attacks that would bleed the Americans dry. But on the ground, officers saw the real situation. Japan had no oil, no steel, and barely enough food to feed its soldiers. Factories stood empty because the fuel to run them no longer existed. Trains had stopped. Civilians melted down pots and pans for scrap metal that could never be used. American B-29 bombers now flew over Japan almost daily, their bomb bays filled with destruction. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, cities that had once glowed with industry, were turned into fields of ash. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed more than 100,000 people in one night. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in flames. And still, the U.S. Navy's ships kept coming. In every captured island, Japanese soldiers had seen the same thing, an ocean covered in American power. Carriers, destroyers, troop transports, hospital ships, tankers, and supply ships stretched beyond the horizon. Even when an American ship was sunk, another would take its place within weeks. The Japanese couldn't believe it. One captured officer later told his interrogators, "We thought you would have maybe a few hundred ships left. Then we saw your fleets come for Okinawa. More ships than we had ever seen in our lives. There was no water left. Only gray steel. That invasion force was, in fact, one of the largest ever assembled in history. Over 1,500 ships carrying 500,000 men. Against such force, Japan had almost nothing left. Fuel reserves were nearly gone, and the Navy had to use wooden training planes for kamikaze attacks because proper aircraft were scarce. The pilots were young, many barely out of school, and flew knowing they would never return. They believed their sacrifice might slow the American advance, but in truth it made little difference. For every kamikaze that struck a ship, 10 more took its place the next day. By summer 1945, Japan's high command finally began to face the inevitable. Reports from the field painted a picture too grim to deny. American submarines had cut off all imports. The army in China was starving, the Navy could no longer fight, and the cities were in ruins. Even Emperor Hirohito, who had long been shielded from the worst news, now understood the truth. His empire was surrounded and collapsing. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, they were seen not as isolated tragedies, but as the final proof of America's limitless reach. To Japan's leaders, the bombs symbolized something far deeper than destruction. They showed a nation that had mastered science, industry, and logistics beyond anything Japan could dream of. After the surrender, as American occupation forces landed in Japan, the surviving admirals and officers finally saw the full scale of what they had faced. In Tokyo Bay, when the battleship USS Missouri hosted the official surrender ceremony on September 2, 1945, the scene itself told the story. Around the Missouri were dozens of U.S. warships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, each one larger and more advanced than anything Japan had left. For the Japanese delegation walking across that deck under the watchful eyes of thousands of American sailors, it was a moment of silence and humiliation. Later, many Japanese officers spoke candidly in interviews and memoirs about their shock. Admiral Yonai, Japan's former Navy minister, admitted, "We underestimated America completely. We thought of them as rich but weak. We never believed they could fight a long war or build so much, so fast." Other officers described their awe at American industry. One naval engineer recalled touring a U.S. shipyard after the war and seeing ships being launched every few days. "We worked for months to build one destroyer," he said. "The Americans built 10 in the same time." Prisoners of war held in the U.S. saw this power firsthand. Japanese sailors who had been captured early in the war were taken to prison camps in America, places like Texas, Idaho, and Wisconsin. At first, they expected cruelty or revenge. Instead, and they found something even more shocking, the sheer abundance of American life. The POWs saw factories operating day and night, trucks hauling goods across endless highways, and shipyards that never stopped. They saw women working on assembly lines, farmers driving tractors, and stores filled with products even in wartime. To men who came from a starving, bombed-out homeland, it was unimaginable. One Japanese prisoner later said, "We realized then that America could never have lost. Even if we had sunk every ship at Pearl Harbor and every carrier at Midway, they would have built them all again. We could not fight a country that made more planes in a month than we did in a year." In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, many of its former officers studied what had gone wrong. They came to see that their greatest mistake wasn't tactical, it was strategic. They had fought an industrial war with a pre-industrial mindset. They believed in spirit over steel, honor over output. But modern war, they now understood, belonged to those who could produce, organize, and sustain.